On my list of my favorite things to ever come out of Steven Universe, the parallels between Greg and Steven rank quite high. Despite both characters growing up in vastly different situations, with Greg's parents being authoritarian and Steven's guardians being anything but, both father and son ultimately have somewhat similar experiences as they learn the same life lessons. And no episode illustrates this intergenerational resonance as well as the third Greg flashback episode, Greg the Babysitter, and that's what we're talking about today. In this final video for the year, we're going to go through 11 of the coziest minutes to ever come out of the show, and just talk about how the theme of change that accompanies Steven's entire journey is present in his father's story as well.
That mud tornado 15 years ago. They called it the Mudnado.
In comparison to the other Greg flashback episodes, this one has a pretty short setup scene in the present, as after Greg mentions when he started working at the car wash, Steven pretty quickly goads him into telling the story, which, as always, kicks off with the song. I think I need a little change is this really cute introduction to Greg's struggle throughout this episode, as the character begins to deal with the conflicting realities of both his desire to spend all of his time with his pink alien goddess, and the fact that he is still, unfortunately, a victim of the human condition. Throughout this song, there are a bunch of really adorable shots. The most poignant probably being this one with Rose throwing Greg up in the air, just as one would do with a little kid. Anyway, in general, the song is great, and the transition to him performing it for cash and completing its central pun is a perfect transition to where we see Greg throughout this episode. The Greg of Greg the Babysitter lives on this really weird border of doing some pretty jerkish things, but also just being too naive and too unaware to truly hate. As well, he does spend the first half of this episode mooching off of, making fun of, and just generally causing a hassle for a single mother. He's also just so goofily unself-aware that it's impossible to not still like the character. Speaking of that single mother, the first half of this episode gives us another look at young Vidalia, who is just absolutely terrific throughout this entire thing. Besides just having a litany of great lines as she either makes fun of or threatens to kill Greg, with this line being a bit funnier in retrospect.
You better pray your space goddess's magic can bring people back from the dead, because I will destroy you.
Vidalia also represents somebody who was living the same rock and roll lifestyle as Greg, but was ultimately forced to grow up a little bit sooner than he was. Their interactions while he's bumming around her house are really well done here, as the clash of Greg living his rocker lifestyle and Vidalia taking care of her child makes for some really interesting conversations. While I do think they probably could have toned down how much of a jerk Greg is here and still gotten the point across, there's no doubt in how well this works to truly contrast how the initially similar characters have diverged since we last saw them. Eventually, because of some quote lousy 12-year-old, Greg is forced to take a bit of the responsibility that Vidalia has every single day, as she essentially tells him to watch Baby Sour Cream while she goes to work, a task that the shirtless Greg gladly accepts. Greg's first decision of his titular job is to take the kid to the beach, where Rose Quartz finally and literally jumps into the episode and delivers one of my favorite little monologues in the entirety of the series. I really wish that copyright would just let me play it here, but instead you're stuck with a screenshot of the transcript. Anyway, this episode comes right before the end of season 3, and thus right before the show begins to really highlight the moral ambiguity of Rose, as the next dozen or so episodes drop both her mistreatment of Bismuth as well as her shattering of Pink Diamond, the latter of which eventually being replaced by the reveal that her entire identity is a farce. And thus, while this monologue comes from a fairly uncomplicated place to a viewer of the episode as it aired, looking back at it now, Rose going on and on about the beauty of change and how each gem was built to do a certain task hits quite a bit differently. For starters, perhaps no gem in the history of gemkind has rebelled against their destined role as much as Rose, who rejects her diamond heritage and ignites a war against it. I think you can see her realize this in the way that she delivers the monologue, and especially in this little pause right here.
They burst out of the ground already knowing what they're supposed to be, and then that's what they are.
But I don't think this is as simple as Rose just internally thinking about how she's the opposite of whatever she's talking about. I instead think this is her somewhat internally questioning whether or not she was ever able to truly escape her diamond destiny. Only a gem with the power of a diamond would be able to do what she's done. And more so than anything, diamonds are rulers, and that's still what Rose is doing. In this episode that is decidedly not about rose quartz, Greg the Babysitter still delivers this really interesting look into her psyche and how it affects her outlook on the human ability to change. And it's something that's only really possible to catch on a post-series rewatch. Anyway, ridiculously long tangent about that Rose monologue aside, Greg is completely overwhelmed by this philosophical musing, and runs to grab something to write it down, only to come back to find Rose and sour cream vanished. Eventually, after this surprisingly fun chase scene, Greg finds the pair at the amusement park, with Rose having taken her command to watch sour cream quite literally, as she's watched him climb up the Ferris wheel and into a precarious situation. And this is where the moral of Greg's story that he's trying to convey to Steven begins to come in a little thick. As Rose talks about the formulative experience that sour cream is currently going through, with Greg countering that there won't be a sour cream to form into something if he falls. Something that I find really interesting that this episode never explicitly brings up is that even after being told by Greg that her approach to letting sour cream endanger himself to help him grow wasn't exactly ideal, Rose does the exact same thing with Greg, letting him put himself into more and more dangerous situations until it becomes apparent that he's not going to be able to get down by himself, at which point she puts him and sour cream into a literal crib. And even with how dense the Greg of this episode is, it doesn't take him long to figure out the parallels between himself and the baby in his arms, as his realization of his reliance on others as a result of his lack of responsibility hits him pretty hard, as he decides that it's time for him to make a change. At the end of the episode, after both one of my favorite non sequiturs in the show,
Your shirt's clean. You want it back, or are you just gonna go for a topless stroll?
Hey, we all gotta grow up sometime, right?
as well as this genuinely really nice shot of him walking through town, Greg approaches the hiring car wash, planting roots in Beach City as he decides to finally take control of his life. A point well summarized by him back in the present day.
People grow whether they want to or not, but growing up is something you gotta decide to do.
This hopefully shouldn't come as a surprise to you, especially if you listened to me talk about it for nearly an hour in the video about the movie last month, but Steven Universe, just like a solid majority of his contemporaries, is a cartoon about growing up, and the changes that accompany it. It's something that Steven is going through throughout the entire series, as his gains in character and experience are symbolized by gains in ability, and as he inspires positive change in those around him. But even in a series that really prefers to give all of its characters happy endings, the idea that change, or growth as this episode puts it, is inherently always something that is going to be positive is just something that's not seen in Steven Universe, as characters both have temporary setbacks, like Lapis or Spinel, or just continue to change in negative ways, with Jasper being the most obvious example of this. And it's this idea that one must work at it for the change in their life to be beneficial that drives Greg's story throughout this episode. While it will be a few more seasons before we learn the full details of Greg's childhood, it's pretty clear at this point in the series that he left a more typical life to live the rock and roll lifestyle we now know him for. And while this episode certainly isn't trying to imply that that decision was a mistake, Greg the Babysitter clearly portrays a Greg who is trying to hold onto that part of his life while simultaneously burdening others with having to take care of him. Most pointedly, Fidalia. Speaking of which, Fidalia's characterization as a single mother of a little kid is one that you don't see very often in cartoons, but I think they handle it really well to show how quickly she's changed from her last appearance as a carefree teenage girl to a responsible and caring mother, and how Greg, albeit under less drastic circumstances, can and ultimately will also settle down and begin taking some more responsibility. Something that this episode thankfully and somewhat surprisingly doesn't outright mention is the implication that this experience with Rose and Greg taking care of sour cream together and her seeing up close the human necessity for growth is likely what eventually led to Rose and Greg making the decision to have Steven a few years later. And that's where, in my opinion, the real beauty of this episode lies, as without Greg's ability and decision to change for the better, he never would have settled down to the point of the pair agreeing to have Steven, and without Steven's existence, it's heavily unlikely that Rose would be able to stop the litany of world-ending threats that Steven is able to mitigate. While Greg the Babysitter is a micro version of the series-long growth that Steven goes through, the consequences of Greg's decision in this episode to follow Vidalia's lead and finally grow up are anything but. Anyway, that's about it for me, both for the video and for the year. 2023 was obviously a huge year for the channel, as I started the year at 395 subscribers and on the verge of quitting, and obviously ended it in a completely different place. So thank you so much to everybody who helped make that happen. I think I am going to take a week or so off to start off next year in order to prepare, but after that, I'm going to do everything that I can to make 2024 a somehow even better year for the channel, and I couldn't be more honored than if you joined me on that journey. Either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in 2024 with the best set of videos I can possibly make. Happy New Year, and thanks for watching.